Beneath the streets of modern America there exists a world that official history prefers to forget. A labyrinth of stone corridors, vaulted chambers, and passages so vast that entire trains could pass through them without touching the walls. This is not fiction, this is not speculation. These tunnels exist. They have been photographed, mapped, and in some cases, accidentally discovered by construction crews who were simply trying to lay the foundations for new buildings. The year was 2019 when construction workers in Los Angeles broke through what they believed was solid bedrock. What they found instead was a perfectly arched tunnel, its walls lined with glazed brick that still gleamed under their flashlights despite what engineers estimated to be over a century of darkness. The official explanation came quickly, an old subway project, abandoned and forgotten. But the workers who saw it firsthand told a different story. The craftsmanship, they said, was unlike anything they had ever seen. The precision of the stonework belonged to a different era entirely. This discovery was not unique. In fact, it was merely the latest in a long series of similar findings that stretch back to the earliest days of American urbanization. From New York to San Francisco, from Chicago to New Orleans. Workers have been stumbling upon these hidden passages for over 150 years, and each time the same pattern emerges: initial astonishment, followed by official explanations that never quite account for the scale and sophistication of what was found, and finally silence. The tunnels are sealed, the records are filed away, and the public moves on to other concerns. But some people remember, some people have been paying attention. The story we are about to tell follows one such person. His name was Marcus Chun, and in the spring of 2018, he was a 43-year-old structural engineer working for one of the largest construction firms in the northeastern United States. Marcus had spent 2 decades designing foundations for skyscrapers, bridges, and public infrastructure. He understood concrete and steel the way a musician understands notes. He could look at a support column and tell you within minutes whether it would hold for 50 years or 500. What Marcus did not understand, at least not at first, was how the tunnels beneath Philadelphia could possibly exist. The project had seemed routine when it landed on his desk. The city was expanding its transit system, and Marcus's firm had been contracted to survey the underground conditions along a proposed new line. His team would drill test cores, analyze soil composition, and produce reports that would guide the excavation. It was the kind of work Marcus had done 100 times before. The first indication that something was different came from the ground-penetrating radar surveys. The equipment was detecting anomalies, large voids in locations where there should have been nothing but packed earth and bedrock. Marcus initially attributed these readings to old coal cellars or forgotten utility conduits. Philadelphia, like most American cities of its age, was riddled with such remnants of earlier infrastructure. But when his team began drilling exploratory shafts, the anomalies revealed themselves to be something far more significant. The first shaft broke through into empty space at a depth of 47 feet. Marcus was on site when it happened. He remembered the sudden change in the drill's resistance, the hollow sound that echoed up through the bore, and the rush of cool, stale air that carried with it a scent he could not identify. It was mineral, ancient, and strangely clean. When the cameras were lowered into the void, what they captured made Marcus's heart stop. The tunnel was enormous. The ceiling arched at least 30 feet above a floor covered in fine sediment. The walls were constructed of massive stone blocks, each one cut with geometric precision and fitted together without visible mortar. At regular intervals, alcoves had been carved into the stone, their purpose unclear, but their craftsmanship undeniable. And stretching away into the darkness beyond the reach of the camera's lights, the passage continued seemingly without end. Marcus Chun had built his career on the assumption that modern engineering represented the pinnacle of human construction capability. In that moment, staring at the images on his laptop screen, that assumption began to crumble. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Additional cameras were deployed. Survey teams mapped over 3 miles of tunnels branching in multiple directions. Samples were collected from the walls, the floor, and the strange crystalline deposits that clung to certain sections of the ceiling. And at every step, Marcus found himself confronting questions that his training had not prepared him to answer. The stone blocks weighed several tons each. How had they been transported to such depths? The joinery between them was so precise that a sheet of paper could not be inserted into the seams. What tools had achieved such accuracy? The tunnel system showed evidence of sophisticated ventilation, with shafts that rose to the surface at calculated intervals. Who had designed such a system, and why had all records of their work disappeared? The official response came within 2 weeks. Representatives from the city, the state, and several federal agencies descended on the project site. They examined the findings, collected their own samples, and held meetings from which Marcus and his team were pointedly excluded. When the decisions were finally announced, they carried the weight of absolute authority. The tunnel system was to be sealed. The surveys were to be classified. The construction project would be rerouted to avoid any further contact with the underground structures. And everyone involved was reminded, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that the confidentiality agreements they had signed carried significant legal consequences. Marcus Chun complied. He had a family, a mortgage, a reputation that had taken decades to build. He filed his reports, accepted the revised project parameters, and returned to his normal work. But late at night, when the house was quiet and his wife was asleep, he found himself returning to those images on his laptop, zooming in on details he had not noticed before, and asking himself the question that would eventually consume his life. What else is down there? The answer, as Marcus would discover over the years that followed, was more than he could have imagined. The Philadelphia tunnels were not an isolated phenomenon. They were part of something much larger, a network that extended beneath cities throughout the eastern seaboard and beyond. And the more Marcus learned about this network, the more he began to suspect that the history he had been taught was missing something essential. This is the story of what Marcus Chun found. It is also the story of the people who helped him, the obstacles they faced, and the price they paid for pursuing a truth that powerful forces preferred to keep buried. It is a story about tunnels, yes, but it is also a story about memory, about the relationship between what we see and what we understand, and about the possibility that the ground beneath our feet holds secrets that could change everything we think we know about the past. The descent begins now. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. These hidden histories are disappearing faster than we can document them, and every subscriber helps ensure these stories reach the people who need to hear them. Join us and become part of the recovery. In the months following the Philadelphia discovery, Marcus Chun found himself unable to let go. The official explanation that the tunnels were remnants of some forgotten 19th-century infrastructure project rang hollow to him. He had studied 19th-century engineering. He knew what it looked like. The tunnels beneath Philadelphia looked like something else entirely. His research began quietly in the margins of his regular work. During lunch breaks and late evenings, Marcus searched through online archives, academic databases, and the digitized collections of historical societies throughout the region. He was looking for any mention of large-scale underground construction in the Philadelphia area, any project that might account for what he had seen. What he found was not what he expected. The records from the mid-1800s were sparse and contradictory. There were references to subway proposals that had never been approved, drainage systems that existed only on paper, and mysterious collapses that had claimed the lives of workers without any clear explanation of what they had been working on. But nowhere could Marcus find documentation of a project matching the scale and sophistication of the tunnels he had witnessed. More troubling still were the gaps. Entire years seemed to be missing from certain archives. Reports that should have existed had apparently been lost or destroyed. And when Marcus reached out to local historians and archivists for help, he encountered a pattern that would become familiar: initial enthusiasm, followed by sudden reluctance, and finally, silence. One evening in late autumn, Marcus received an email from someone calling themselves RK. The message was brief. "I saw your inquiries in the Philadelphia Historical Society database. We should talk. Meet me at the Reading Terminal Market Saturday 2 p.m. I'll find you." Marcus almost deleted the message. It sounded like exactly the kind of conspiracy-tinged communication that he had spent his career avoiding. He was an engineer, not a treasure hunter. His work required precision, documentation, verifiable facts. Meeting anonymous strangers based on cryptic emails was not part of his methodology. But the tunnels had changed something in him. The precision of their construction had awakened a hunger to understand, and that hunger was stronger than his skepticism. On Saturday afternoon, Marcus found himself standing near the flower stalls at Reading Terminal Market, feeling foolish and wondering how long he should wait before giving up. He did not have to wait long. The woman who approached him was in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything they looked at. She introduced herself as Rebecca Kowalski, a retired professor of urban archaeology from Temple University. She had been studying anomalous underground structures for over 30 years, and she knew more about the tunnels beneath American cities than perhaps anyone else alive. What Rebecca told Marcus over coffee that afternoon changed the trajectory of his life. The Philadelphia tunnels, she explained, were not unique. Similar structures had been discovered beneath Boston, New York, Baltimore, Washington, and dozens of smaller cities throughout the eastern seaboard. In each case, the pattern was the same: accidental discovery during construction, initial documentation, official intervention, and eventual classification or destruction of records. Rebecca had spent decades collecting fragments of this suppressed history, piecing together a picture that the authorities seemed determined to keep hidden. The tunnels, she believed, were part of a vast network that had once connected the major population centers of the continent. They had been built using techniques that modern engineering struggled to replicate, with materials that showed unusual properties and designs that served purposes we no longer understood. And they had been systematically covered up, their entrances sealed and their very existence erased from public memory. Marcus listened with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. His training demanded evidence, and what Rebecca was describing sounded more like mythology than history. But she had anticipated his skepticism. From her bag she produced a tablet containing thousands of photographs, survey documents, laboratory analyses, and eyewitness accounts, all carefully organized and cross-referenced. This was not the work of a conspiracy theorist. This was the work of a scholar. Over the following months, Marcus became Rebecca's student and collaborator. He learned to navigate the maze of public records, to recognize the signs of official tampering, and to connect with the network of researchers, engineers, and amateur historians who shared their obsession with the tunnels. He discovered that the community was larger than he had imagined, bound together by shared experiences of discovery and suppression. The evidence they had accumulated was compelling. In New York, construction workers had broken through into a tunnel system beneath Manhattan that extended for miles beneath the current subway lines. In Boston, renovation of a historic building had revealed a passage leading to a chamber filled with machinery of unknown purpose. In Washington, geological surveys had detected voids beneath the National Mall that did not correspond to any known construction. But the most startling discoveries came from the Midwest and West. In Chicago, the Great Fire of 1871 had exposed entrances to tunnels that were quickly sealed and forgotten. In St. Louis, the construction of the arch had required the destruction of tunnel sections that workers described as impossibly old. In San Francisco, the earthquake of 1906 had collapsed passages that connected the city to networks extending beneath the bay. The pattern was consistent: discovery, documentation, suppression, erasure, and running through all of it was a question that Marcus found increasingly difficult to ignore. If these tunnels had been built by known civilizations using known methods, why was their existence being hidden? What was down there that someone did not want the public to know about? Rebecca had her theories. The tunnels, she believed, were remnants of a pre-existing infrastructure that had been appropriated and built upon by later civilizations. The magnificent stonework predated the colonial period, perhaps by centuries. It had been created by a civilization that possessed technologies we no longer understood, a civilization that had been erased from history so thoroughly that only its underground monuments remained. Marcus found this hypothesis difficult to accept. His engineering mind demanded explanations that fit within the framework of known physics and documented history. But the more evidence he examined, the harder it became to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been taught. The stone blocks used in the tunnel construction showed traces of precision machining that should have been impossible before the Industrial Revolution. The ventilation systems incorporated principles of airflow that had only been scientifically understood in the 20th century. The tunnel routes followed patterns that suggested awareness of geological conditions at depths that would have required technology unavailable until the modern era. Something did not add up, and Marcus Chun, who had built his career on making things add up, found himself confronting a mystery that resisted all his attempts at resolution. It was during this period of intense investigation that Marcus made the connection that would prove most significant. While analyzing maps of confirmed and suspected tunnel locations, he noticed something that others had apparently missed. The tunnels were not randomly distributed. They followed patterns, converging on certain points and diverging from others in ways that suggested deliberate design. When Marcus overlaid these patterns on maps of historical significance, the correlations became striking. The convergence points aligned with sites of unusual importance: ancient mounds, early colonial settlements, locations of reported anomalous phenomena. The tunnels were not just a transportation network. They were a system designed to connect places that held meaning for whoever had built them. This realization marked the beginning of a new phase in Marcus's research. He was no longer simply documenting the existence of hidden tunnels. He was trying to understand their purpose, to decode the logic behind their construction, and to discover what they might reveal about a history that had been deliberately forgotten. The answers, he would soon learn, were closer than he imagined, and more dangerous. The breakthrough came in the form of a woman named Sarah Mitchell. She was 78 years old, had spent 40 years working as an archivist for the National Archives in Washington, and she had secrets that she was finally ready to share. Marcus received her contact information through Rebecca's network. The message that accompanied it was simple. She knows about Section 14. She's willing to talk. But be careful. This is not information that certain people want released. Section 14. Marcus had encountered references to it before, always oblique, never explained. It appeared in footnotes of declassified documents in the margins of architectural surveys, in the whispered conversations of researchers who had been around long enough to know what questions not to ask. Whatever Section 14 contained, it was apparently significant enough to warrant special protection. Marcus drove to Sarah Mitchell's home on a gray November afternoon. She lived in a modest townhouse in Alexandria, Virginia, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of a lifetime spent preserving the past. Books lined every wall, papers covered every surface, and in a corner of her living room, protected by a locked cabinet, were the documents she had spent decades smuggling out of the archives. Sarah did not waste time with pleasantries. She'd been watching Marcus's research for months, she explained, waiting to see if he was serious. Too many investigators started strong and then faded when the pressure began. She needed to know that he would see this through. Marcus assured her that he would. Whatever she had, whatever Section 14 contained, he wanted to know. Sarah nodded slowly. Then she began to talk. Section 14, she explained, was a classification system that predated the modern national security apparatus. It had been established in the decades following the Civil War, during a period of massive infrastructure development across the continent. Its purpose was to manage information related to discoveries that, in the words of the founding directive, might undermine public confidence in the established historical narrative. The tunnels were the primary focus of Section 14. Throughout the late 19th century, as cities expanded and railroads pushed westward, construction crews had repeatedly encountered underground structures that defied explanation. The scale of these discoveries, and the questions they raised about who had built them and when, had alarmed officials who feared the social instability that might result from public awareness. A decision was made at the highest levels of government. The tunnels would be documented, but their existence would be concealed from the public. Entrances would be sealed. Records would be classified or destroyed. And a narrative would be established, attributing any unavoidable discoveries to known historical projects, regardless of whether the evidence supported such attributions. Section 14 was the mechanism for implementing this policy. For over a century, it had operated in the shadows, managing information, discrediting witnesses, and ensuring that the tunnels remained hidden from public knowledge. Sarah had discovered Section 14 early in her career, when she had been assigned to organize materials from a warehouse of uncatalogued documents. Among the boxes of routine correspondence and bureaucratic records, she had found files that should not have existed. Maps showing tunnel networks beneath every major American city. Engineering analyses concluding that the construction methods used were impossible for any known historical period. Reports from military officers describing chambers filled with machinery they could not identify. Over the following decades, Sarah had quietly copied these documents, building an archive of her own. She had hoped that eventually the information would be released through official channels, that some future administration would recognize the public's right to know. But as years passed and the secrecy only deepened, she had come to understand that official disclosure would never happen. The truth would only emerge through those willing to risk everything to reveal it. Marcus spent 3 days at Sarah's home, photographing documents and recording her testimony. What he learned during those days transformed his understanding of the tunnel mystery. The network was far more extensive than even Rebecca had suspected. Section 14 files documented tunnel systems not just beneath American cities, but extending throughout North America and connecting, through passages beneath the ocean floor, to similar networks in Europe, Asia, and Africa. The tunnels were global in scope, a planetary infrastructure of staggering scale. The construction dated to a period long before recorded history. Laboratory analyses of stone samples conducted secretly by government scientists had returned dates that were impossible according to conventional archaeology. The tunnels had been built thousands of years before the earliest known civilizations, using methods and materials that modern science could not replicate. And the purpose of the tunnels, according to the most speculative Section 14 reports, was energy. The underground network was designed to harness and distribute some form of power that official science did not recognize. The crystalline formations Marcus had observed in the Philadelphia tunnels were not geological deposits. They were components of a system, part of a technology that had once powered whatever civilization had created this vast underground world. As Marcus absorbed this information, he felt the foundations of his understanding shifting beneath him. Everything he had been taught about human history, about the development of technology, about the capabilities of ancient peoples, was called into question by what Sarah Mitchell had revealed. But with understanding came danger. Sarah warned him that Section 14 was not a passive archive. It was an active operation, with personnel who monitored research into the tunnels and intervened when investigators got too close to sensitive information. Several researchers had disappeared over the years. Others had been discredited, their careers destroyed by coordinated campaigns of misinformation. Still others had simply stopped asking questions, persuaded by pressures that Sarah declined to specify. Marcus understood the risk, but he also understood that the information could not remain buried forever. The truth about the tunnels, about the civilization that had built them, about the history that had been erased, belonged to everyone, and he was now among the few people who could help bring that truth to light. Before we continue, I need you to do something. In the comments section below, I want you to write these words: "The truth is buried, but it will rise." Say it with me. The truth is buried, but it will rise. This is our declaration, our commitment to remember what has been forgotten. Leave this comment now, and join the thousands of others who refuse to accept that the past can be erased. The decision to enter the tunnels was not made lightly. Marcus understood the risks, both legal and physical. But the documents from Sarah Mitchell had revealed something that demanded first-hand investigation: a convergence point. A location where multiple tunnel systems came together in what Section 14 reports described as a central hub. And that convergence point was located beneath the city of St. Louis. Marcus assembled a team. Rebecca Kowalski would provide archaeological expertise. David Torres, a former Navy diver who had worked on underwater construction projects, would handle equipment and safety. Elena Vasquez, a journalist who had been investigating the tunnels for a documentary that never found funding, would document everything they found. And James Wright, a retired surveyor who had spent 30 years mapping underground utilities, would guide them through the labyrinth. They arrived in St. Louis in March when the weather was unpredictable but the tourist crowds were sparse. Their cover story was a geological survey for a private development company. They had permits, equipment, and credentials that would withstand casual inspection. What they did not have was any legal right to enter the tunnel system that Section 14 had ordered sealed over a century ago. The entrance they had chosen was in an abandoned industrial district along the riverfront. According to Sarah's documents, a warehouse in this area had been built directly over a tunnel access point. The building had been condemned for decades, its ownership lost in a maze of corporate shells and dissolved partnerships. No one would notice if a group of surveyors spent a few days working inside. The tunnel entrance was exactly where the documents indicated it would be. Behind a false wall in the warehouse basement, they found a steel door that had been installed in the 1920s, its surface covered with warnings and government seals that had faded with time. The lock yielded to James's expertise within minutes. Beyond the door, stairs descended into darkness. The first thing Marcus noticed was the air. It was cool, dry, and remarkably fresh, confirming the existence of the ventilation systems described in the Section 14 reports. The second thing he noticed was the silence. It was absolute, a complete absence of sound that pressed against his ears like a physical presence. They proceeded slowly, their headlamps cutting narrow paths through the blackness. The tunnel was constructed in the same style Marcus had seen in Philadelphia: massive stone blocks, precision joinery, alcoves at regular intervals. But the scale here was different. The passage was wider, the ceiling higher, the sense of space more expansive. After approximately a quarter mile, they reached the first intersection. Tunnels branched off in 4 directions, each one leading into its own darkness. James consulted the maps they had assembled from various sources, comparing them to the readings from his survey equipment. The convergence point lay to the southeast, through a series of passages that descended deeper into the earth. They would need to travel approximately 2 miles underground to reach it. The journey took 3 hours. The tunnels twisted and turned, rose and fell, passed through chambers of varying sizes and purposes. Some were empty, their walls bare stone that bore the marks of ancient tools. Others contained remnants of machinery, metal frames corroded beyond recognition, ceramic vessels filled with crystalline residue, channels carved into the floor that had once carried something. as though what that something might have been, no one could say. Elena recorded everything, her camera capturing details that would later become crucial evidence. David maintained constant vigilance for structural hazards, testing floors and ceilings before allowing the group to proceed. Rebecca examined inscriptions and markings that appeared on certain walls, comparing them to examples from her research. And Marcus walked in a state of wonder that bordered on disbelief. He had seen photographs. He had studied reports. He had believed intellectually in the existence of the tunnels. But experiencing them directly was something else entirely. The precision of the construction, the sophistication of the design, the sheer improbability of their existence, all of it combined to create an effect that was almost spiritual. It was walking through a monument to a forgotten civilization, a testament to capabilities that history had erased. The convergence point announced itself long before they reached it. The tunnels began to widen, their walls becoming more elaborately carved, their ceilings rising to accommodate structures that grew increasingly complex. Channels multiplied, running along the walls and floor in patterns that suggested some kind of distribution system. The crystalline formations that had appeared sporadically throughout the journey now covered entire surfaces, their facets catching the light from the team's lamps and throwing rainbows into the darkness. And then finally they emerged into the chamber. It was vast. Their lights could not reach the ceiling. The walls curved away in both directions, suggesting a circular space of enormous diameter. And in the center of the chamber, rising from a platform of polished stone, stood the structure. It was a column, perhaps 50 feet in diameter, and extending upward beyond the reach of their lights. Its surface was covered with the crystalline formations arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate design rather than natural growth. Channels radiated outward from its base, connecting to the tunnels that converged on this point. And from somewhere within its structure came a sound that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. It was a hum. Low, constant, barely audible, but unmistakably present. The column was vibrating, producing a frequency that Marcus felt in his chest as much as he heard with his ears. After perhaps thousands of years of abandonment, something within this structure was still functioning. The team stood in silence, overwhelmed by what they were witnessing. David was the first to speak, his voice hushed with awe. "This changes everything," he said. "Whatever they tell us about history, about what's possible, it's all wrong. This proves it." Marcus nodded slowly, but he also understood that proof was meaningless without context. They needed to understand what this structure was, how it worked, and why it had been hidden. They needed to document everything, analyze everything, and find a way to share what they had discovered without being silenced the way so many others had been silenced before them. They spent 4 hours in the chamber, photographing every detail, taking samples, and recording the strange hum that emanated from the central column. Elena's camera captured images that would later circulate through underground research communities, generating debates that continued to this day. Rebecca identified symbols that matched patterns found at ancient sites around the world, suggesting connections that challenged every conventional theory of human history. And Marcus, standing before the column with his hand pressed against its crystalline surface, felt the vibration passing through his body, and understood that he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. When they finally emerged from the tunnels, 12 hours after their descent, the world above seemed different. The same streets, the same buildings, the same sky, but all of it underlaid by a secret that most people would never know. They had seen what lay beneath the surface, and that knowledge had changed them forever. The work of sharing that knowledge would occupy the rest of their lives. The aftermath of the St. Louis expedition unfolded more quickly than Marcus had anticipated. Within a week of their return, signs appeared that their activities had not gone unnoticed. It began with small things: unfamiliar vehicles parked near Marcus's home, unusual activity on his computer, programs opening on their own and files appearing in locations where he had not saved them, phone calls that connected but produced only silence before disconnecting. Then the larger interventions began. Rebecca Kowalski's university office was broken into, her files scattered and her computer confiscated by campus security under the pretext of a routine audit. David Torres received a visit from representatives of a government agency he had never heard of, who asked detailed questions about his recent activities and implied that his veterans' benefits might be subject to review. Elena Vasquez's journalism contacts began distancing themselves, citing concerns about her credibility that had apparently emerged from sources they could not identify. And Marcus himself received a letter delivered by courier to his workplace, informing him that his engineering license was under investigation due to complaints about his professional conduct. The complaints were anonymous, the specifics were vague. But the message was clear. Continue this work, and your career will end. The coordinated nature of these responses confirmed everything Sarah Mitchell had warned about. Section 14 was not a historical relic. It was an active operation with the resources and authority to reach into every aspect of their lives. And it would not stop until they had abandoned their research or been neutralized as threats to the information it protected. Marcus convened an emergency meeting of the team. They gathered at a cabin in rural Pennsylvania, owned by a friend of Rebecca's who asked no questions about why they needed an isolated location. For 3 days, they debated their options. The case for stopping was strong. They had families, careers, futures that could be destroyed by continued resistance. The forces arrayed against them were vast and apparently omnipotent. And even if they succeeded in releasing their evidence, what guarantee was there that anyone would believe them? The history of suppressed discoveries was littered with researchers who had been dismissed as cranks, their evidence ignored or explained away. But the case for continuing was stronger. They had seen the tunnels. They had stood in the convergence chamber. They had felt the vibration of a technology that should not exist, a remnant of a civilization that had been erased from human memory. To possess that knowledge and remain silent was to become complicit in the erasure. Whatever the personal cost, they had an obligation to the truth. The decision was unanimous. They would continue, but they would change their methods. Direct confrontation with Section 14 was suicidal. But there were other ways to ensure that information survived. They began by distributing copies of their evidence to researchers around the world. USB drives were mailed to academic institutions, historical societies, and private collectors. Encrypted files were uploaded to servers in multiple countries. Bedrock arrangements were established with journalists who specialized in stories that mainstream outlets would not touch. The goal was not immediate disclosure, but preservation. If anything happened to them, the evidence would survive. They also reached out to others who had encountered the tunnels. Sarah Mitchell's documents contained references to researchers who had been active in previous decades, some of whom might still be alive and willing to share what they knew. Marcus spent months tracking these individuals down, conducting interviews that added crucial details to the picture they were assembling. One of these interviews proved particularly significant. Edgar Townsend was 92 years old, living in a care facility in upstate New York, and his mind was still remarkably sharp. He had worked as a civil engineer in the 1960s when the interstate highway system was being constructed. What he told Marcus confirmed suspicions that had been building for months. The highway system, Edgar explained, had not been built solely for transportation. Its routes had been carefully selected to avoid certain areas where construction would have revealed the underground network that someone wanted to keep hidden. At the same time, sections of the highway had been specifically routed over tunnel entrances, sealing them permanently beneath millions of tons of concrete and asphalt. Edgar had been part of the team that conducted preliminary surveys for Route 70 through Missouri. They had discovered a tunnel entrance that matched the description of the convergence point Marcus had visited. When Edgar reported the discovery, he was transferred to a different project the following day. Within a week, the entire survey team had been reassigned, and the tunnel entrance had been filled with concrete before construction proceeded. Similar events, Edgar said, had occurred throughout the country. The highway system was not just a transportation network. It was a burial system designed to ensure that the tunnels would never be rediscovered. This revelation added a new dimension to Marcus's understanding. The suppression of the tunnels was not merely a matter of hiding embarrassing historical evidence. It was an ongoing project, continuously adapting to new circumstances and employing vast resources to maintain the concealment. Whoever was behind Section 14 considered the tunnels important enough to shape the entire infrastructure of modern America around their secrecy. The question of motivation remained unanswered. Why was the existence of the tunnels so threatening? What did they represent that justified such extraordinary measures to keep them hidden? Marcus began to develop a theory. The tunnels were evidence of a civilization that had possessed technologies far in advance of anything known to official history. If that evidence became public, it would undermine the narrative of human progress that formed the foundation of modern society. The assumption that we were the pinnacle of human achievement, that our ancestors were primitive and our trajectory was ever upward, would be revealed as fiction. And with that revelation would come questions that powerful institutions did not want asked. Questions about where the technology had come from. Questions about what had happened to the civilization that created it. Questions about whether someone somewhere still understood how to use it. These were dangerous questions, and those who asked them, as Marcus was learning, faced dangerous consequences. 5 years had passed since Marcus Chun first encountered the tunnels beneath Philadelphia. In that time, he had lost his engineering license, his marriage had ended, and he had been forced to sell his home to cover legal expenses related to lawsuits that seemed designed to bankrupt rather than prosecute. Rebecca Kowalski had died of cancer, her final month spent organizing her research for eventual publication. David Torres had moved to Costa Rica, where he continued to coordinate the team's international distribution network. Elena Vasquez had produced a documentary that no major platform would carry, but which had been viewed millions of times on alternative channels. And the evidence continued to accumulate. Researchers in Europe had documented similar tunnel systems beneath Paris, London, and Rome. Asian investigators had found corresponding networks beneath Beijing, Delhi, and cities throughout the Middle East. The patterns were consistent across continents: massive scale, precision construction, crystalline components, and systematic suppression by authorities who seemed to follow a coordinated global protocol. The picture that emerged was staggering in its implications. The tunnel network was not just American or even continental. It was planetary, a unified infrastructure that had once connected every major population center on Earth. Its construction had required engineering capabilities that modern civilization could not match, and its existence had been hidden for centuries, perhaps millennia, by forces that operated across national boundaries and through successive generations. The purpose of the network remained partially mysterious, but certain conclusions had become unavoidable. The crystalline structures were energy components designed to collect, concentrate, and distribute some form of power that official science did not recognize. The tunnel routes followed patterns that corresponded to geological features, particularly areas of unusual electromagnetic activity. The convergence points, like the chamber Marcus had visited in St. Louis, were nodes in a system that had once operated as an integrated whole. Whatever civilization had built, the system had achieved something that modern humanity had not: a technology that worked with the Earth rather than against it, drawing power from natural processes without depleting resources or producing waste. They had created an infrastructure that could have lasted forever had it not been deliberately destroyed and hidden. The question of who had destroyed it and why remained unanswered. But Marcus had developed theories that he shared only with his closest collaborators. The tunnels had been sealed not by natural disaster or gradual abandonment, but by deliberate action. Someone had decided that this technology should not exist, that the knowledge behind it should be erased from human memory, and that decision had shaped the course of history ever since. The implications were profound. If the tunnels represented a technology that could provide unlimited energy without environmental damage, then its suppression had condemned humanity to centuries of conflict over finite resources. Wars had been fought, empires had risen and fallen, millions had suffered and died, all while a solution to the fundamental problem of energy scarcity lay buried beneath their feet. Marcus did not know who had made the decision to hide the tunnels, or what their motivations had been. But he knew that the decision had consequences that extended to the present day. And he knew that revealing the truth, however difficult, was essential if humanity was ever to reclaim what had been taken from it. The final phase of their work focused on public disclosure. The years of evidence gathering, documentation, and distribution had prepared the ground. Now it was time to bring the story into the open. They chose their moment carefully. A conference on alternative archaeology was being held in Mexico City with attendees from around the world who had spent years researching suppressed historical evidence. Marcus would present the team's findings, supported by photographs, samples, and testimony from dozens of witnesses. The presentation would be live-streamed to a global audience, and copies of the evidence would be simultaneously released to researchers, journalists, and public archives in multiple countries. The day the presentation arrived, Marcus stood before an audience of 500 people, with millions more watching online. He began with the story of the Philadelphia discovery, describing the tunnel he had seen and the questions it had raised. He traced the investigation through the months and years that followed, introducing the team members who had joined him and the evidence they had accumulated. He showed photographs of the St. Louis's convergence chamber, played recordings of the mysterious hum, and presented laboratory analyses of the crystalline samples they had collected. The audience listened in stunned silence. When Marcus finished, the applause was thunderous. But what happened next surprised even him. People began to stand up in the audience, sharing their own stories. A construction worker from Chicago described tunnels he had seen during renovation of a downtown building. An archaeologist from Arizona spoke of underground chambers that had been sealed by government order. A retired military officer revealed that he had been part of operations to destroy tunnel entrances in South America. The conference became a gathering of witnesses, a collective testimony to a hidden history that had touched countless lives. By the time the day ended, the story had spread beyond any possibility of containment. The tunnels were public knowledge. The months that followed were turbulent. Official denials were issued, followed by investigations, followed by grudging admissions that certain underground structures did exist, though their origins and purposes remained under study. Academic debates erupted over the age and construction methods of the tunnels. Governments formed committees to examine the implications of the discoveries, and slowly, gradually, the narrative began to shift. What had once been dismissed as conspiracy theory became a subject of legitimate inquiry. New excavations were undertaken, this time with proper documentation and public oversight. The evidence that Marcus and his team had gathered was verified and extended by researchers around the world. The full significance of the tunnels remains unknown to this day. We have begun to understand what they are, but we are far from understanding what they mean. The civilization that built them, the technology they employed, the reasons for their suppression, all these questions await answers that may take generations to discover. But Marcus Chun accomplished what he set out to do. He brought the truth out of the darkness and into the light. He ensured that the tunnels could no longer be denied, that the evidence could no longer be suppressed, that the history of our world could no longer be told without acknowledging what lies beneath our feet. The descent that began in Philadelphia led ultimately to a new understanding, not an ending, but a beginning. The tunnels are still there, waiting to be explored. Their secrets are still there, waiting to be understood. And the civilization that created them, whatever happened to it, has left us a message that we are only beginning to read. The past is not dead. It is not even past. It is beneath us, around us, and within us, waiting to be remembered. If you watched until the end, it is because this story resonated with something inside you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who you are and understand who truly values the stories on this channel. And if you have not yet subscribed, do it now. Every subscription helps ensure that these hidden histories continue to be told. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and join us in the work of remembering what has been forgotten. The tunnels are waiting, the truth is rising, and you are part of the recovery.